Hey everyone, welcome back to Chat Cemetery. Today I am speaking with James Gonis, who is the director of The Lawnmower Man, A Suburban Nightmare. We are talking all about his Dollar Baby short today. James, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we're just going to dive right on in here. And I'm curious how you got into Stephen King. Was he one of the authors you were reading and watching the adaptations for before you decided to do this short? Or was he relatively new to you when you ended up doing The Lawnmower Man during your time at NYU?
I guess I had been reading him for 5 or 6 years. My interest in King started when I saw a trailer for Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and I thought, "Wow, I should see what this guy's all about." And I picked up the paperback of The Stand, and that just got me hooked. And this was around 1980, so for 5 or 6 years, I would pick up anything King that I could find. And in the mid '80s, all the adaptations started coming out too. So there was Stephen
Right.
King fever going on, and the Lawnmower Man in Night Shift had really stuck out among those stories to me because it was just so bizarre and had such a bleak ending, and it was also a little bit sort of like a creep show story, especially as it was adapted by I think it was Walt Simonson in the Bizarre
Yes.
Adventures
Right.
Marvel magazine. And, it hadn't been that long since Creepshow. So it seemed like that might be a fun story to adapt. And it was just so strange. It was also a challenging story to adapt. It's like, okay, how are we going to do it? And we were young, kids who just thought, okay, well, let's take it on. We didn't know any better. And yeah, it turned out to be certainly a challenge, but it was also a lot of fun. I had hoped that there would be some sort of an adaptation of it, and I remember seeing in Famous Monsters magazine that Milton Subotsky of Amicus Productions was planning to do an anthology of King films, including The Lawnmower Man. And I was waiting for it, and it just never happened. So when the time came in film school to do a short film, and I couldn't come up with an original story at the time, and I thought, well, let's do something different and let's adapt the King story, and that's how it started.
You also worked with Michael De Luca on this. He was the one who wrote it. Were you two already friends and sort of connecting over Stephen King material? Is that how you two came to work on this?
Yes, we were in a class together that was called Junior Narrative, and we would support each other on our short films. I think he was making a horror short at the time, and he wanted to use the music from Creepshow, and I had the soundtrack, so I lent it to him. And we would hang out socially. We would do things like go to all night diners and make lists of our 100 favorite movies and things like that. And Mike was particularly helpful in that I was at a point where I was overthinking everything. And when it came to adapting the story, I needed Mike to help simplify it and be more direct with it. And he came up with something that really worked. I think he referred more to the Bizarre Adventures adaptation than the original Night Shift story, and that made sense because it was already kind of visualized and storyboarded
Right.
in there. Yeah.
So, what was the process like from start to finish with this?
Well, the one thing I remember the most is that I was
Right.
daunted, because this was we had done silent films. This was the first time we were doing color. This was the first time we were doing sync sound. This was the first time we actually had to kind of spend money. We could use the school's equipment, but I think I was late in renting it, filling out the rental form, so I actually had to pay to rent equipment. And then we'd have to find actors and locations. So, each of those things presented a challenge, but they everything also sort of fell into place as we were meeting those challenges. I got very, very lucky with the casting. We had put an ad in Backstage magazine, and the person who answered the ad to be Parquet, the homeowner, he came on and he was awesome, and he asked if his lady friend, could play his wife. And she was a character actress named Helen Hampt, and she had been in Woody Allen movies, and she was in Arthur, and uh, she's in all these movies, very often typecast as kind of a bag lady. But she was an institution in off Broadway, which I didn't even realize at the time. So the two of them were awesome. And then we didn't find Karis, the Lawnmower Man, through backstage. That was an actor friend of a friend. And he said, well, my friend Andy would be potentially agreeable, even though it was a very, very odd and challenging part. But Andy certainly looked the part. He was a very large guy, and he was spot on. I mean, we couldn't have lucked out more than with those three actors. And then, it was also a matter of jerry rigging all these little special effects and making sure that it was going to look good. And I was very lucky. I had a very, very good cameraman and an assistant cameraman who they totally knew what they were doing, and we were completely in sync. And yeah, I was just I was scared all the time. I mean, I was God, I can't remember how old I was. 19 or 20 years old, and I was having heart palpitations. But finally getting through all of that and finally shooting it, we stopped for a while, and then we picked up again, and months later, and you could tell because the main actor his hair length changed. So it's like, wow, hope nobody notices this. And we also made really, really stupid mistakes. There's one shot where you can see the tripod case in the background. There's one shot, if you listen really carefully, you can even hear me say action. I mean, it's that sloppy. But all told, after we had everything in the can, we were really excited about the way that it looked. We had another period of time go by. We graduated. We already got graded on the rushes of the film before it was ever edited. And then I went back to NYU, and I found an editor who was working on getting his grade for editing a movie, and he was really talented, and also a sound mixer. And then found a composer who would do it for nothing. So it all came together, and we really, really thought what we had was worth seeing through to the end. So even though it was finished after graduation, there was no question that we would finish it, because it would just be too sad not to.
I think that's something that definitely comes through when you're watching the short, because then you have these film festivals that picked it up, 2-3 years later, and then later on in 2004 when they did the first Dollar Baby Festival. So that's something that's pretty cool to have, your student film, even with some of those mistakes you mentioned, and have it sort of just have this longer life than I imagine you were probably expecting.
Absolutely, and I'm grateful that that we made the decision to adapt Stephen King's story back then, because there were a lot of student films that were screened in those years, and many of them were very much more technically polished than mine, and some of them were very, very good. But by the virtue of being a King adaptation, and then the virtue of being faithful adaptation, it's kind of remarkable that you and I are even talking about it so many years later, and that yes, the film festivals and being mentioned in books, as a footnote or whatever, it's amazing.
Yeah, I'm going to be totally honest here. I don't know how many of the Dollar Baby adaptations I'll be covering, just because of how hard some of them are to find, but your version of The Lawnmower Man, because it was a true adaptation, unlike the feature film that comes later in the 90s, which I probably won't even bother with because it's not even remotely close to following the story. It just felt like something that I had to include in this, because even if it's a student film, it's the only adaptation, as far as I know, that actually follows the story and, puts this effort in that you aren't seeing with the other film that Stephen King pretty much renounced himself. He was like, no, this is not my story.
Right, right. So that, the fact that it was so unfaithful and that the king did renounce it ended up helping the reputation of my film. And it is interesting that, I'm sure that there's many Dollar Babies and many short stories that might have been adapted more than once. And every so often I check around to see if there's any if there's been any adaptations of Lawnmower Man since mine. And oddly enough, I don't see any.
It'll be interesting to see if one comes about because we're seeing this age of Stephen King movies being remade again. You know, we have It and It Chapter 2. You have Pet
Right.
Sematary. Because of the advancements in technology, it would definitely be interesting to see even, you know, a 20-minute version or like yours, a 12-minute version of The Lawnmower Man again, just to see how different someone else might approach it, and with all of the technological advances, how they make those special effects come to life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny. I never even went back and read the 12-page story uh, since we started making the movie. I read it when I was 15, and I was really kind of jarred and riveted by it. But I got so close to the material through the adaptation that I just didn't want to go back and reread it. So I'm sure that there would be other approaches to the adaptation that might not be quite so kind of creep showish, tongue in cheek, or campy. And this was just the one that we went with at the time, and it worked well for what the time sort of dictated and what an audience I think could process, considering how strange the story was.
Yeah, that's something I've been looking into as I talk about the adaptation specifically. It's like, okay, what year was this made and what are some realistic expectations for how good it would be? You know, you have something like the 1979 version of Salem's Lot or even Cujo. And in Cujo, I caught where they had someone reach up and grab the dog and pull the dog down out of the window, and you see that arm go up. So it's like even in the bigger budget films, you're catching these little mistakes just because of the time when it was made and the fact that they probably couldn't do the same take 20 times because even though it was a higher budget, they still didn't have the time or the money to just keep doing things over and over to try and get it exactly perfect.
Right, right, sure. And I mean, the one thing as far as my film goes is that it is a student film. It was a student
Right.
film. This wasn't even a commercial enterprise. This was just kids sort of learning how to shoot and edit and tell a story. And that, I think that shows. I think that anybody approaching it with a sense of, okay, well, I want to see something entertaining. I've read some kind of disparaging reviews about how amateurish it is, and that's a given because yes,
Right.
it's a student film. What I'm really kind of pleased and happy about, as I said, is that we found really really interesting actors and that everything was in focus and that whether we had a creative editor and that it all just sort of came together. And it's as a curiosity, as a novelty, it's like, hey, here you go, take it for what it is.
Absolutely. How would you say that working on the Lawnmower Man short sort of impacted what you wanted to do with film going forward? Was this one of those moments where you realized, okay, this is something I really want to focus on, or did you sort of end up going in a different direction after film school?
It was so challenging, because at the time I was a real kind of bookish introvert. And, in a way, maybe I still am. And taking on something that's going to require meeting so many different challenges based on the personality I had at the time, I frankly never wanted to do it again. It's like, okay, well, this was cool. I survived it. I'm happy with the result, but I did not get the director's bug. I was not ready to go out and say, okay, what's next? And instead, I figured, okay, the purest way to tell a story without having to deal with all of these logistical challenges, which I, was so uncomfortable with, was to write, was to be a screenwriter. So that's what I got into right after NYU, and that's I had moved from New York to Los Angeles to embark on that career, and I've had a little bit of success in it, but not anywhere enough to continue it on as a career. So other career opportunities prevailed, and I got into a different line of work, but. In answer to your question, it also occurred to me that the way that it was shot, there wasn't a lot of fluid camera. I was not all that adventurous, and I didn't really think that that I had any unique voice or vision or style. I thought, okay, well, this is maybe a little bit like John Landis because you don't see the camera really moving all that often. There's a lot of static shots, and so okay, well, maybe maybe I don't really have vision. Maybe I'm not cut out to be a director. Maybe I'm cut out more to tell a story in other ways, or to somehow interpret stories, or to write about them. So that's how that experience sort of shaped the rest of my life and career.
Yeah, it is nice to know that it was this big learning experience for you, because it's one of those things where I feel like in the entertainment industry in general, whether it's film, music, or anything else, you sort of have to try a bunch of different things to figure out what it is that really grabs you and what you end up wanting to do. You know, with music, you can do the business side, you can do the production side, you can do live music. And I imagine with film, there's even more directions you can go just because of how many people it takes to make a film and all of the different things that go into it. So it's always nice to see when someone can look back on their work and be like, you know, I had fun doing this, don't want to do it again.
Yeah. Yeah, if I was having palpitations at that age, I just, I don't think I was cut out for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that wraps up all of the questions I had for you on the short. It was very nice getting to talk to someone who is actually involved hands-on with one of these projects, because as we were saying, you know, there's a lot of dollar babies out there, but you know, if I go through and talk about every single one, this podcast might not ever end. So, you know, I already have to compete with, you know,
Right,
Stephen
right.
King still continuing to write books and all of these remakes coming out. So I was like, all right, I'll sort of pick and choose some things here and there that are maybe lesser known works and put a spotlight on those. So I want to thank you again for coming on to talk about this. But I know you also have a podcast yourself. So do you want to give that a quick shout out?
Thank you. Yes, I do. I co-host a podcast called Monster Party, and as the title implies, it's all about horror and sci-fi and fantasy. It's me and three friends getting together, having some drinks, usually inviting on an interesting guest, and then just talking about the stuff we love. And we've been doing it for about 5 years, and it's a free podcast. Anybody can find it. It streams on YouTube, and it's also available on iTunes and wherever podcasts are available.
That's awesome. I'll definitely be sure to link to that so everyone can find it. And again, James, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this.
Thank you, Deanna. This was a lot of fun.
Of course. And to our listeners, you can follow us at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.